です。
Thank you. I would like to analyze 4 issues in my speech. First of all, how should we consider the reproductive rights that open opposition explained? Secondly, let me analyze the nature of act of giving birth, which is the answer to point of information given by closing opposition. Thirdly, the social progress and birth lottery. And finally, as intergenerational immorality, why shifting economic and social burden onto next generation is immoral for current generation to take. So first of all, about how should we consider reproductive rights? We acknowledge that conceptions of reproductive right exist, but when you exercise reproductive right, you instigate harm to other individuals. That is why on the basis of a harm principle, we believe exercising this kind of reproductive rights should be considered as immoral. Just like a speech, you have a right for free speech, but when you exercise free speech and you instigate harm to other individual under the hate speech law or defamation, under that circumstances, we call that immoral. And that is why under this specific conception of a standard, we believe this kind of exercising reproductive rights should be considered as immoral. Secondly, their argumentation is tautological. When you do not exercise reproductive rights, human beings will extinct, right? We understand that will happen, but that's good. That's why we would like to welcome the circumstances. This debate is about value judgment, whether that is good or bad. Moving on to the second issue about the nature of the act of giving birth. The point of information from the opening closing opposition is how is it different from like secretly murdering someone, suffering from misery or the injustices in the world? The difference is the murder is an active act of instigating unconsensual pain to individuals. These individuals have already existed in our society. These people have already experienced goods and bad of their life, ladies and gentlemen. Therefore, these individuals, already exist individuals, necessarily feel suffer and pain when we murder them. But on the case of the act of not giving birth, this is non-existent, ladies and gentlemen. Nothing existed in our society. At this specific point and stage of chronological order, we are able to reduce all the possibility of misery and suffering. That is why we choose not to give birth. This is the same as why abortion is legalized in South Africa, but infanticide is not okay. Because abortion, we are able to reduce all the harm and suffering for prospective children, but infanticide is criminalized in South Africa because children of infants have already existed in society. Therefore, murdering those individuals necessarily instigating the suffering and pain. There is a qualitative distinction between these two different choices, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on to the third issue of this debate, about the social progress and the birth lottery. We acknowledge that individuals are able to overcome the hardship or predicament by making efforts or improving governmental system or policy making system. But all those kind of efforts are predetermined by the social progress or the socio-economic circumstances. There's a very little chances in which individuals are able to collectively overcome predetermined social circumstances. So what kind of circumstances we are talking about? When you happen to be born in a liberal society or privileged family, then you are able to rely on like rich government policies, or you are able to rely on many like social welfare system. But when you happen to be born in financially desperate country, it's very difficult for individuals to rely on government provision of welfare, for example. All these kind of like measure the opposition talked about is completely dependent on the coincidence or the extent of social progress or lack of social progress. Ladies and gentlemen, when you happen to be born in misogynistic and sexist country, you necessarily have to suffer the consequences of your misery. Why is this immoral? Because at the point in which birth is given, the destiny is predetermined regardless of individuality, regardless of individual effort. Ladies and gentlemen, two different parallel worlds exist in our planet. The one world is liberal and privileged society, just like us. We are enjoying debating on Sunday instead of labor in sweatshop. In other parts of the world, the racism is embedded or institutionalized. There is no option. No one chose to be born in the circumstances, but people are locked and forced to bear the consequences, even though they didn't choose at all. It's our responsibility, or our current generation's responsibility, to make compensation for that. But we force next generation to suffer because of our selfish choice of exercising reproductive rights, and that is negative trade-off. No, thank you. Moreover, we acknowledge that there is a hope for the future improvement. But let me make a trade-off. Yes, there is a hope, but that kind of hope in social progress is very unlikely, and that's going to be a coincidence or lack of social fortune. At the same time, the current suffer or misery is we are able to acknowledge and foresee and predict When we make this kind of trade-off, it is immoral for us to choose inequitable option. That is why this kind of trade-off is unfair. Finally, about shifting economic and social burden onto next generation. Before moving on to, do you have any point?
So current generation, according to your logic, has never consented to the kinds of suffering they might have to suffer in the current generation, especially when there will going to be a massive population decrease.
No. Firstly, that is why we need to take this proposal and make a narrative that this is immoral to continue this kind of activity. Secondly, even if that's the case, it is unfair for us to further aggravate or exacerbate this kind of intergenerational immorality. That's my final argumentation. My final argumentation is about giving birth to new life means shifting all the social burden onto next generation. It is immoral that current generation necessarily abandon our own moral responsibility and force the next generation to take responsibility and compensate for injustice that current generation perpetrates. So what kind of social injustices are we talking about? For example, financial debt. The government is releasing a disproportionate amount of national debt. The next generation will have to pay for that. Or pension system in the context of economic shrinking, or deforestation, or desertation, or use of natural resources, or emission of CO2, or use of plastic bag. Negative externality of using and squandering all the political, financial, and natural resources necessarily decapacitate the next generation to receive the same quality of life. This is immoral for two reasons. Firstly, current generation prioritize our own short-term satisfaction under mass consumerism and knowingly refuse to take responsibility. And all of us here understand that the next generation will suffer, but we never stop our current standard of living. It's same as savior siblings, right? The parents knowingly give birth to like second sister or second brother in order to save another agency. Instead of maximizing the happiness or satisfaction for that individual, we are doing exactly the same thing for the next generation. We give birth in order to satisfy our own satisfaction, and this is immoral. Finally, continuity of current life decapacitates the next generation to enjoy the same quality of life because resource is zero-sum. We don't have an infinite number of natural resources. We don't have an infinite number of political and economic resources, but we all knowingly squander all the resources but give birth to the next generation so that the future generation knowingly will suffer from the lack of natural resources and political resources. And that is immoral. We are happy to propose. Thank you.